so the sun doesn't hit me so much.
Okay, hello everybody and welcome on 99 Media. My name is Carlo and tonight I've got the honor of hosting Costas Lapavitsas, who is, well, I don't think he needs a lot of presentations, but he's a professor of economics at the SOAS University of London, and he's author of many books. He's an expert on financialization. The most famous books are Profiting Without Producing, How Finance Exploit Us All, I think is the subtitle. And then in 2023, he produced a collective work that is titled The State of Capitalism. Thank you very much, Costas, for being with us.
It's my pleasure, Carlo. I look forward to a discussion, and thank you for the invite.
So there were so many topics that I wanted to ask Costas that we decided to split it into sessions. So there's going to be another occasion for another interview, which is actually going to happen at the beginning of July. With OTTOLINATV Media, we're going to hold a festival in close to Pisa. And so during this first interview, I will ask Costas a lot of questions about the so-called de-dollarization, changing of hegemonic, let's say, powers. So I'm going to start with the first question. Let me start with a provocative one, to which I will kindly ask you to answer as much as possible in a simple yes or no way, even though I can imagine it's not really an appropriate answer. But anyway, this is the question. So for the first time in the history of the dollar as an international reserve currency, during the financial panic that accompanied Trump's so-called trade war, we saw that liquidity did not shift away from the, let's say, stock market towards the US bonds, as historically would have normally happened. But rather, we experienced significant sales on the US bond markets, as well as, let's say, the flight from stocks. So many commentators think that this led also to Trump's U-turn and a withdrawal postponement of the tariffs, including the ones towards China. So the question is, if you think that the US has finally become a normal state, and if this is, let's say, the start of the end of the exorbitant privilege of the dollar.
The answer is no. The US has not become a normal state, meaning a state like the others. But this might indeed be a significant step towards the demise of the dollar from the dominant position that he has held for decades. That might be the beginning of a process, but it hasn't happened yet. We're some way from it yet. The US and the dollar will be with us for some time, and it will be a source of imperial power for the United States.
Okay, so before I move to the second question, because I think it will be quite interesting also, let's say, for everybody to appreciate what I meant by normal state. So say you are Argentina or Sri Lanka, you run a massive deficit. You can just print your way out of your current account deficit by printing money. That will lead to a lot of inflation, because I guess that nobody would really want to trust you with purchasing your currency. So could you explain us why is it that the dollar has enjoyed this status of so-called exorbitant privilege?
The position of the dollar in the world market, the world capitalist market, has been extraordinary since 1944. It's not new. We're talking 80 years here, during which the dollar has acted as world money. Properly speaking, quasi-world money. In other words, it has been doing what gold used to do back in the day, in the 19th century, when gold was acting as world money. The dollar has been acting as quasi-effective world money for 80 years. But it's very, very important when you look at that to differentiate between the time until 1973, 74 and the time after that. It's of paramount importance. The period from 1944 to say 1974, 1973, 74, 30 years, right, is a period in which the dollar did act as world money, but the dollar was linked to gold. So if you were a central bank, not a regular capitalist, but the central bank of another state, say France, you could take your dollars to the Federal Reserve Bank and demand that they should be turned into gold at $35 to the troy ounce. Because of that, this condition, which obtained among central banks, exchange rates were fixed, stabilized, because all currencies, the main ones, could be translated into gold, and gold is gold, right? So this was a period of fairly stable and fixed exchange rates. What allowed that to obtain was not, of course, only convertibility into gold, but controls over capital flows, big controls over international capital flows, and controls over banking and finance domestically. This was the foundation of what has become known as Keynesianism. And Keynes was very keen on that. Keynes, incidentally, was a major speculator. He had made millions. He understood how these markets worked, but he also understood that they needed controlling and that they were disastrous. So the first period of the dollar as world money operated on this basis. What happened during that time, however, was that a lot of countries, France, which I mentioned before, accumulated a lot of dollars. And they accumulated a lot of dollars because the United States was running deficits in trade. And it became very difficult for the United States to convert the dollar claims into gold. And so the United States unilaterally abandoned this system, lifted the convertibility of gold, of dollar into gold, and that was the end of what was the Bretton Woods system, which is what I described. The period since then, 50 years that have followed since then, are very different. The dollar continues to act as world money. It still is the quasi-world money of the global market, but the conditions are profoundly different. There is no convertibility of dollar into gold. And so exchange rates are flexible. And that has been the characteristic of the period. Instability of exchange rates. Unprecedented, historically unprecedented instability. In the past, until 73, 75, it would be unthinkable that a major exchange rate, two major currencies could move by 20%, 25%, 30%. It would be just unconscionable for the classical political economists or other economists that this could be happening. For us, in the 50 years that have passed, that's the regular way of life. That's the kind of capitalism we've been living in. So exchange rates have become flexible and very unstable. And during the same period, and a key reason for the instability of exchange rates is that controls over capital flows have been lifted, capital has become free to move, and controls over banking have been lifted. So banking has become deregulated, decontrolled. The combination of these factors are obviously one key element of financialization of capitalism and globalization of capitalism, because obviously capital goes across borders. The dollar is the pivot of that system. It works still as world money, but it doesn't work in the same way as before, right? It works like before, but it also doesn't work like before. And that's important to understand. The United States and the main imperial powers worked out a system of managing that slowly and over time. They didn't know what to do it to begin with. They weren't sure. They didn't know how to manage it. And they've developed institutions, practices, mechanisms to handle it. They don't succeed at all. I'm not suggesting for a minute that they succeed all the time. It's a very unstable system, the system that generates all kinds of global crises. But it's 50 years. It's 50 years. They've learned how to do it. It's 50 years in which the currency that acts as world money is unconnected to anything of value. It's unconnected to gold. This is unprecedented in the history of capitalism. I mean, Karl Marx would never have conceived that. That you could have 50 years of it. There have been periods before where the dominant money of a major capitalist country would be unconnected to a produced commodity like gold. There have been periods like that before. But here we're talking 50 years. We're talking of a regular system, of a structural reality. And the dollar is the pivot of that. The dollar is the foundation of that. The United States knows it. And it knows that because of that, this way of managing the world economy, it draws enormous imperial strength. It realizes that. And it will defend it, come what may. You should have no illusions about that at all. The United States will not become what you call the regular country before without a fight. It's not going to happen. It's going to defend the privileges of the dollar, the ability of the dollar to be the world money, come what may.
Well, it looks like it's kind of happening. And well, this is basically already, you almost answered already my second question, but I think it's, you mentioned Karl Marx and the idea of the value form. So I think that it would be really interesting in delving a little bit more into this idea. So I'm going to go back to my question anyway, but because I think it really adds a little bit and maybe allows you to complete the reasoning that you just started. But from basically what you just said, the role of the dollar as the so-called value form that is capable of attracting money capital is key in the perpetuation of the US dominance, because basically what they can do is that they can rebalance by surpluses in the capital account the deficits that they have in the current account, if we can simplify slightly the mechanism. And this centrality of the dollar has been key in structuring the hegemonic position of leading states in history. But as you just said, it's now 50 years that this is going on. And normally let's use the classic football analogy. Gold, I guess that as Marxists we're not gold bugs, but we could probably see it as a sort of referee that wouldn't have allowed somebody in deficit to carry on having this bonanza of capital flows that come in to buy their bonds for such a long time. So how do you think that this came through, and in the era of fiat money? Because I guess that another thing that Marx, I guess that maybe there are elements in his thought that could be dealt with also with money not as a commodity, but he lived in an era where gold was the gold standard. So
let's take it. These are all crucial questions. Let's take Marx made a number of original contributions to the theory of money. Okay, people don't realize, and a lot of mainstream economists don't know, and a lot of Marxists have been slow, especially Western Marxists, understanding the full depth of Marx's monetary work. He made a lot of contributions, but one key contribution was the idea of world money, which I've already mentioned. He took that idea from the mercantilists, and in this respect, he was different from the classical political economists. See, Marx argued that money in the world market doesn't work in the same way as money works in the domestic market. And the reason is that the domestic market is not like the world market. The world market is not the domestic market, but bigger, right? That's not how it works. The domestic market is homogenized, coordinated, organized by the state. And has rules, regulations, and works in a certain way where the law of value prevails. And money, domestic money, organizes that, backed by the state. The world market is coordinated by no one. It is not organized by anyone. It hasn't got the same set of regulations and so on. It's where capitals and states meet, and there is no such thing as a world capitalist class. It doesn't exist, right? Capitals fight each other, and states fight each other. And that kind of instrumental anarchy always appears in the world market, always. The thing that holds it together is world money, because obviously there has to be some kind of reference to value, some common accepted element of value for all these capitalists operating globally and all these states transacting globally to be able to communicate with each other and to be able to settle accounts. That's world money. So world money, in a way, is the organizing principle and mechanism of the world market, giving it some kind of coherence, and in a way acts very differently from domestic money. It's not regulated like domestic money is. You get all the contradictions at the international level of the capitalist economy coalescing onto world money. What must it do then? First and foremost, it must act as a means of hoarding, a reserve, to preserve value. If I transact globally, if I'm an Indonesian capitalist exporting goods to Brazil or importing goods from Brazil, the other way around, I would want my money that I use for that to be able to have an acceptable form that can maintain value over time. That's what world money does. For the first thing I must do across the board. Second thing it must do, it must act as means of payment. I must be able to settle obligations with it, not just for goods I buy, but obligations, debts that I might have, and so on. It must be good for paying. Third, and crucial, has become very obvious the last few decades, the decades of the collapse of Bretton Woods. It draws a lot of power from and acts effectively as world money when it is the unit of account in key global markets, when it is the unit in which prices are formed for key commodities, and the most important commodity here is energy, oil. So world money acts as world money when it is the unit of account for that, when prices of oil are measured in dollars, not in yuan or in other things. So the currency that can replace the dollar and deliver these functions can operate as a kind of world money. And the United States has imposed its own currency for this purpose. It didn't have to be that way. Keynes, who was a very clever economist, had proposed other ways of doing it, paying, keeping value, measuring value. But the United States insisted, no, the dollar will do it. Because obviously, the United States knew that if its own domestic currency does that, then the power it has over the world market is enormous. And the power it has over the world market is measured in terms of the things that you already mentioned. If I run a deficit in commodities, then I can cover my deficit by simply producing more dollars domestically, which I can use to pay internationally. And if I also have global capital flows, because capital can move freely, and I have debt instruments as the United States government, which foreigners buy because they think that it's a good reserve for their value, then capital comes in. That is basically what happens. I borrow from everybody. That's not saving, incidentally, by those who buy the United States government paper. That's a mistake that neoclassical economists often make. It's not saving. Africa doesn't save in United States government bonds. You need to save that. That Africa keeps value for paying in dollars because it has to. And the money flows into the United States. So the United States has drawn enormous benefits from the dollar acting as world money, and it knows it. But obviously, and that's where the problem is for the United States today, in order for that to happen, it must also be the case that others must have access to dollars. Otherwise, it won't work that way, right? Others must have access to dollars. And the value of the dollar relative to other currencies cannot be allowed to fluctuate very much, and it cannot be allowed to drop very much. Because obviously, if I am issuing the dollars and I'm counting on others to obtain dollars for me to be in this position for a long time, then the dollar cannot fall very much, because if it falls very much, the other guy loses value, right? So the dollar is not delivering the function. That's the bind for the United States. The United States would like the dollar to fall so that it can make good some of the deficits it has in trade, but it cannot allow the dollar to fall very much, because then the dollar will stop functioning as world money. So that is, in a sense, the cost of the imperial position. You cannot be an imperialist and have everything your way. You can be an imperialist and have major benefits from dominating world money, but there'll be a cost. And in a way, that's what Trump is trying to navigate today.
I was thinking exactly that. So basically, that's basically a very good answer to the implied question that Trump cannot have his aid and eat it too. There's an intrinsic contradiction between the reindustrializing the US idea, assuming that then you can do it with the tariffs, but I guess that's another discussion, and keeping the international role of the dollar.
It's insoluble. It's insoluble. And those who, Americans, Trump advisors, because Trump doesn't really think much along those lines, but the Trump advisors who attempt to resolve it, they keep going round and round in circles. They keep thinking, it's insoluble. Now, there's one element, however, which is in a sense extra economic, which might allow us to bring another dimension in here. And it's this. And it comes again from Karl Marx, who took it from the great mercantilists. In this regard, incidentally, Karl Marx was different from the classical political economists, because Karl Marx took a lot from classical political economists, but he was not a classical economist. He was a Marxist, right? But on this issue, the issue of world money, he diverged from the classical economists, and he went back to the mercantilists, which incidentally Keynes also did. And all the great economists, when it comes to the world market, go back to mercantilists to a certain extent. And so what Marx observed about world money, other than the economic functions which I mentioned, is that at the level of the world market, where you have state interacting with state, not just capitalists interacting with capitalists, business with business, but state with state, you don't just have economics at play. You also have political, ideological, and other coercion, right? And world money is an instrument of coercion. It is the sinews of war, which is what the mercantilists used to say. And obviously, back in the day, even the Catholic Church used to argue things of that type. And Marx retained some of that in his theory. And we learn from it as Marxists. That at the level of the world market, world money is also an instrument of power. It isn't just an instrument of economic activity, but naked power. And this power it can project as money, but it can draw its functioning as money from power generally. In the end of the day, in other words, the functioning of a domestic money as world money depends on military power. So the ability of the United States to keep its own domestic currency as world money doesn't only depend on economics, which I've discussed, unit of account and all this. It crucially depends on the U.S. Army and the number of U.S. bases circling the globe and the naked military power of the United States, which goes together with the weaponizing of the dollar, which we've seen the last several times the last few years. So the dollar as world money is a condensation, a crystallization of imperialism and hegemony today. That's why it's important.
All right, thank you very much. It was really, really good answer. So this actually opens up. I've got two more, and I think that they both link very, very closely to what you just said. And the third one, I think, is something important for people on the left to sort of remember what really is imperialism nowadays and the importance of currency and in this sense, the role of the dollar to determine really who is the hegemonic bloc and who is not. But here's the question. So some people see China as a rising power that is determined to challenge the hegemony of the US by simply taking its place. So just substituting hegemony for another one. Others, following theorists such as, for example, Giovanni Arrighi or the Monthly Review School, see China as a state whose different class base imposes different choices, both internally and internationally. So, for instance, the internationalization of the yuan is a policy that would imply intrinsic contradictions, because on one hand, one could see it as a final blow to the US hegemony, since offering as an alternative store of value, as you said before, to international capital would really be like a very, very big blow to the hegemonic dominance of the dollar, because you're offering capital another store of value. But on the other hand, this would curb the foundations of the capacity of the PCC, the Communist Party of China, to maintain its dominance over capital, both internal and international. So my question is, if you see China's decision to keep control over its state money as not only a proof that is sort of like trying to manage it as a way to climb to the top, but also as a proof that is not acting as a traditional capitalist state, and in a world that is heading towards military confrontation, if we could take it as a proof that China could act in a stabilizing and peaceful way.
Let me start with the last part.
Okay.
I believe in anti-imperialism and anti-war campaigning and movement that comes from below. I don't trust any state, and I don't believe that the left should align itself with particular states confronted with this. I think the left must be independent, and he must put across a pro-worker, pro-poor, pro-people position that doesn't fall for the merits of any particular state. Having said this, obviously not all states are the same, clearly. And we must recognize that. And the main dominant, the most aggressive imperialism is that of the United States. The main threat to world peace. Now, how to connect that to money, though, is the question you're asking me, and to the issue of imperialism. Let me say one more thing here, which might be of interest to people who are trained on the left and still know and remember the classic arguments of the left. Our theory of imperialism comes from Lenin and from Hilferding and from the great classical Marxists of the turn of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. It's interesting when you look at those theories, and my understanding in terms of method comes from that, not in terms of what everything they say, but in terms of method comes from that. It's interesting when you look at that world money is absent from their theories. That's a remarkable absence. It's a striking thing. Whereas we know from the work of historians that the British Empire, which was the dominant imperialist at the time, drew a lot of imperial power from the gold standard, which was pivoting on London. And yet the great Marxists didn't analyze world money as a constituent element of imperial power in that time. That's an interesting absence, which we must make good. Because today, in the conditions of today, to talk about imperialism without directly connecting it to world money, you wouldn't know what you're talking about. It's impossible. It's impossible to talk about imperialism today without directly connecting it to world money in ways that we've hinted at, in ways that we've suggested so far. So that's a very, very important point. Now, let me sum up, because we can talk about this for a long time. China is a major contestant for hegemony. It's clear. There's no question. Anybody who doesn't see that doesn't understand what's happening in the world. It's a major contestant for hegemony. I've got no time for people who go into arguments which are essentially almost like religious arguments. Is China imperialist? Is it not imperialist? What does it take to be imperialist? That's not the way to go about it. The way to go about it is to look at the main constituent elements of what is Chinese capitalism, because the core of the economy is capitalistic. It might not be capitalistic in the same way as the United States is, but it's capitalistic. Anybody who doesn't see that, again, doesn't see anything about China, right? So China is a major contestant. The United States is no longer the main productive power in the world. In terms of industry, it's not even in the same league as China. It doesn't produce anything like the steel or aluminium or anything like that. It is not. The difference is gigantic in terms of productive capacity, domestic, national productive capacity. The United States is also inferior to China when it comes to commercial capital. China is a bigger trader. It's a bigger trader and a thicker trader. It has more trade connections with more countries. It's a more important trading partner for more countries than the United States is. So China contests the position of the United States in terms of production and in terms of commerce. China is not in the same league when it comes to finance, however. The United States is dominant when it comes to finance. And it's dominant because the biggest banks, the biggest investment funds across the world are US capitalists, and their role is supported by the dollar. The dollar allows the United States to maintain its dominance in finance. China knows this, of course. And it knows this for two reasons. China accumulates reserves in dollars. It must. Otherwise, it would not be able to participate in world trade like any other country. China is also exposed to the dollar because the large Chinese corporates, and there are some huge ones now operating globally, operate with the dollar. People don't understand that. The big Chinese enterprises don't work with the yuan, they work with the dollar. And they are exposed to the dollar. So China knows very well that the dollar is the pivot of US imperial power.
May I just ask, do they operate financially or in terms of trade with the dollar?
In every respect. The way in which they engage in their international transactions is dollar based.
Okay.
So China knows that. Can China challenge this aspect of US hegemony? Before I answer that, let me tell you what China can challenge to see the difference. The United States used to be the main, as I said, the main dominant power in production, in trade, and so on. There were other imperialists. It still exists. Britain, France, the traditional imperialists. What made the United States a hegemon? The United States was a hegemon among the imperialists because it set the rules of the game. It dictated the rules of trade, the rules of investment, the rules of shifting capital across borders and so on. It was the dominant power that did that. And the hegemon, like Gramsci has told us, and like Polanyi told us after Gramsci, the hegemon sets the rules in such a way that others also have a little bit of leeway. The hegemon never takes everything, because if the hegemon took everything, then he or she wouldn't be the hegemon, right? So the United States was the dominant imperial power because it set the rules of the game and it allowed a little bit of leeway for others. China challenges that. China wants to have a say in how the rules of the game are set, in tax, in investment, in everything to do with the major organizations. And it does it actively. It does it in Africa. It does it in the main organizations like the United Nations or the WTO and so on. It challenges US hegemony directly in this regard. But it cannot challenge the dominance of the dollar. Why? Because to challenge the dominance of the dollar, China would have to do two things which are connected and very dangerous for the Chinese economy right now. It would have to lift capital controls, and it would have to lift controls over banking if it did that. It would have to properly financialize, because China is not financialized. It would have properly to financialize. If it did that, the entire model of Chinese accumulation would be transformed, and it would be very dangerous for the power structures within China. And the Communist Party of China doesn't want to contemplate that. The Communist Party of China is, of course, the social force that controls accumulation in China, capitalist accumulation, right? And doesn't want to contemplate that. And so it keeps controls over capital flows, and it keeps controls over banks. Now put yourself in the shoes of the Indonesian capitalist I mentioned to you before. I am an Indonesian capitalist, and I export or I import goods from Brazil. Would I keep my money, my capital, in Chinese yuan when I know that the capital controls that China applies are quite restrictive, and when I know that the Chinese state dominates the banks and its political decisions that dictate much of the bank behavior? I wouldn't. That form of money would not, bank money by Chinese banks would not be trustworthy. That's how it translates, because this must translate for the individual capitalist too. Otherwise, it makes no sense. Otherwise, it's just general talk, right? Yeah. So in this regard, it's not surprising that the Chinese yuan is between 3 and 4% of global reserves. Why would I want to keep my money in Chinese yuan if I'm a globally operating capitalist? It's not safe for me. So in this regard, China has got a long way to go, because the structural impediments are very big, and the Chinese state doesn't want to contemplate them, doesn't want to go down that path. And it's right not to go down that path, because if it deregulates finance, and if it lifts the control of a capital, it will be dramatic disturbance of the Chinese model. And that's not something that they're prepared to do. That is a structural ball and chain when it comes to China becoming hegemonic power. And people have to realize that. That incidentally also holds for the BRICS collectively creating a replacement currency, which is the other dream that many people have. People think that creating, I mean, I just mentioned to you how difficult it is to have a world money if you're an individual, a single state, which is very powerful, like China. You can multiply that by 100 if you think that collectively 6, 10, 12, 15 states of varying power and size could create a currency that would replace the dollar. I mean, people say that who don't understand what it takes to create a global currency, how much regulation must exist, and how much policy convergence and all the other preconditions. So that's not really on the cards. One thing that is on the cards, though, and I'll finish with that because I've been talking for some time, is this. It's interesting to note that as the world moves towards cryptocurrencies, which we can discuss on another occasion, as the world moves towards cryptocurrencies, several countries, including China, but several developing smaller countries, who feel the pressure of the dollar, because obviously it's imperial power, right? The Americans know, and they exercise imperial power through the dollar. Several countries who feel the pressure of the dollar are trying to create crypto-based digital currencies and try to transact with each other in this kind of money. It's still very early days to know whether that will become a sustainable reality. for capitalism ahead. But definitely the signs are there, with China in the lead. China is a leading country for creating state-based digital money, which can be used globally. So much of the attention on digital currencies has gone on to the domestic market. The real importance is of the world market. If there is some kind of mechanism that might emerge in the coming years, whereby smaller countries can settle their accounts, pay each other, transact with each other in digital money produced nationally. Like I said, it's very early days and so on, but there are signs that this might happen. Now, that would be a real challenge to the dollar, if that were to happen. And it's not accidental, and I really finish with this, that when it comes to crypto, Trump, who is a big supporter of cryptocurrencies, right? And he makes money out of it himself, has stopped the Federal Reserve from creating central bank digital currencies, while at the same time, he has been promoting stablecoin. Those who understand how these things work know that stablecoin is based on the dollar. And so any move that says stablecoins are good, which is what Trump is saying, actually strengthens the dollar globally. And that might be a US response at the global level for maintaining dollar dominance, digital dollarization, use stablecoin, my friend. It's cheap, easy, and of course it's based on the dollar. So that might be a way, that might be a kind of competition that we will see economically and obviously politically in the years ahead.
Now, I just wanted to add a couple of questions and maybe clarification. So let's start from the main one. I guess that even leaving aside economics and thinking about the dialectics between state and capital, I think I assume that you would agree that in China there is even though the accumulation mode is clearly capitalistic, at least since Deng Xiaoping, there is a subordination of capital as opposed to the political power. And I will say, and this is where I would like you to say if you agree or not, that this is already a massive step in case you even contemplate the possibility of building up socialism. Because if you think about the difficulty of organizing any sort of political action in Europe, in Greece, I mean, you have got first-hand experience of this. It's really, really hard to re-establish a priority of state over capital. So if this could be at least one thing to come back to, because there's a lot of people on the left, a lot of I don't want to label the various factions that just go, no, this is just opposite imperialism. It's full-on capitalism. This is it. Look how bad they exploit labor. I know that that could be a thing. It definitely is true, but it's clear as a different stuff. And then the other element is that, especially nowadays, China hasn't had a main war since 1979. I think I couldn't count how many wars the US did since 1979. It's like probably hundreds.
And Britain and France.
And now it looks as if pretty much everybody now in these days is at war, because the Pope call it grande guerra a pezzi in Italian. It's like in pieces. Now every piece is sort of like cumulative coming up, and the only country that looks as if it's standing not at war with anyone else is China. So I appreciate the point that you made at the very beginning, that the left has to not alienate its own brain into let's say blind loyalty to a brand or a party or something. But aren't there also some facts that at the end of the day should make you, if really pushed, I kind of see that there is a clear difference between the two models.
Okay.
Sorry.
You're going right to the heart of it. And obviously we could be discussing that for a long time. I can also understand why people on the left who want to oppose imperialism, particularly imperialism from their own countries, are prepared to see the other side as different and so on. And often it is different. I'm not denying that. I want to make a couple of points before I get to the meat of it. The first point is, if you cast your mind back to the era of classical imperialism, when Lenin wrote, it would have been easy or plausible to have an argument about the poor Germans whom history had treated unfairly, because the French and the English had divided the world because they were ahead of the game, took everything, took most of Africa in the 1880s and 90s, and left only Namibia for Germany, which was poor and undeveloped and so on. And this is not fair, because the Germans were not really, German capitalists were not really same thing as the English imperialists. They were hardworking people who produced goods and sold them across markets and worked for progress and so on. It would have been easy to, and actually there were Germans who were arguing these things. And Lenin's argument was, no, yeah, the German imperialists are not like the English imperialists, but the left can see the difference, but we need an independent position, right? And so that's very important. Second point about China. China is the second largest military spender in the world today. United States spends more than $1 trillion, 1.1, something like that. China spends 240, 250, depends, because a lot of these things are obscure. 250, 260, up to 300 billion, which is huge, huge. Britain spends a fraction of that, a quarter of what China spends. So China is a big spender. It's got the largest navy in the world. And if you were Filipino or a Korean, it wouldn't look the same way as it does when you're Western European. So a little bit of caution, though I understand China has not been involved in wars and has not been aggressive, nothing like the way the United States has been. Let's be a bit more measured about it. So in both scores, I would say we need to be cautious. And we need to understand the difference between China and the US and other Western European imperialists, but we cannot align ourselves with China. China is not a natural ally of the left. That's not what's happening here. Now, as for the mode of capitalism in China, that's probably the most interesting dimension of them all, because really, you do get private capitalism of substantial size, right? You also get state capitalism, state-operated enterprises of even bigger size. There was a time when, 15, 20 years ago, when people trained in US universities, with a classic American difference between the market and the state, this kind of very shallow position, believed that private capital would be in opposition to public state-owned enterprises in China, and that would create liberal capitalism. What a load of nonsense. Neither private capital nor public capital in China are separate entities. Actually, there's an intermingling. Private capital has got public investment and public interest in it, and public state-operated enterprises admit of private investment. There's actually an intermeshing of capital property in China. The state-operated enterprises are the backbone of the Chinese economy. They're increasingly operated on the basis of capital. This is how it's supposed to be. In other words, profitability, fundamentally. Although the Communist Party of China oversees the lot, both private and public capitals. And that's the big difference. The Communist Party of China is 90 million people, 100 million people. It's an institution, which is not a real Communist Party, but it's an institution that controls the market and sets prices, sets rates of growth, sets targets of this type, and disciplines capital, as you suggested before. And and it's enough to mention, I've mentioned it before in other discussions, but I'll mention it here to you too, that the big bosses of the state-operated enterprises in China are not simply members of the Communist Party. I mean, if you're going to be anywhere near big business in China, you'll have to be a member of the Communist Party. They're not just members of the Communist Party. They're in the economic committee of the Politburo of the Communist Party. I mean, they are people right at the heart of decision-making, right? So obviously, it functions differently, and it admits of political input in ways which we don't see in the United States. There is also political input in the United States. For instance, Wall Street has got enormous political input in the economic functioning of the United States, but nothing like China. And that is a good reason why the last 4 or 5 years, Xi Jinping has been shifting the pivot of economic activity and focus away from capital. You know, it's a sort of beginning to, again, going back to managing through appointment, through a kind of nomenclatura, you know, through kind of positioning. And that is, of course, not capitalistic in the way of the West. These are very important dimensions, and we've got to be aware of them, and we've got to discuss them all the time. But the core of the economy is capitalistic. There is that we must never lose sight of that. The core of the economy is capitalistic, and China contests capitalist hegemony in its own way. One last point here. Trump knows that China is the main contestant, and it isn't new. He made it clear back in 2018 when he launched the first trade war against China. And Biden, who had a very different position generally to Trump, continued the war against China. So this is a position well understood by the American ruling bloc. Okay, it's not accidental, or it's not nothing to do with Trump alone. So Trump knows that. Trump knows that China is the main contestant. What is interesting here, and has to be appreciated, is that in opposing China, he has stopped behaving like the hegemon. And that's very interesting. Like I mentioned to you before, the hegemon is the hegemon because the hegemon dominates and allows the subordinate ones some leeway. You know, Britain can be Britain, France can be France, because I'm the big boss, right? And they can have their... Trump isn't like that. Trump has stopped functioning as a hegemon. Trump says, America first, it's me, I'll take everything, and nothing for you. That might indeed be the beginning of the unraveling of American hegemony. But we still have to wait. We have to wait and see how it pans out. And we have to keep analyzing. And above all, we need an independent position, and a position against war and against militarism that doesn't have anything to do with China, right? Or Russia or whoever else.
All right. I think it would be, I mean, I could just ask maybe one last thing, but because I do see that there might be a point in which there is not, obviously I do respect a lot your opinion, and I don't want to, challenge it, but there might be a difference in, maybe being slightly more lenient towards a more positive idea of what could be the potential of, because, you could push back to these arguments saying that, China has been in a way sieged by imperialism for, since.
Let me put you, if I were an African, right? If I were an African, Tanzania, Kenya, whatever, where it's obvious, right? The last thing I would want to see is European imperialists.
Yeah, exactly.
Because they've left nothing behind. They've left nothing. They came to my country, they raped it, they've left nothing behind. They treated me like a slave. They treated me like an animal. They've left nothing. Good riddance, right? And you can see what the sub-Saharan Africans or the Saharan Africans are doing to the French. Get out, So I can understand that full well. And I can also see that if the Chinese come, they might want to take my resources, and they might be the dominant power, but they might leave a hospital behind, or they might leave a railway, or they might leave a port, right? I understand that. That's why I'm saying it's not. I'm not equating the two. I'm not suggesting for a minute that there is no difference. I can see the difference. All I'm saying is we need an independent position. I don't share. I mean, I don't believe that Xi Jinping is the leading anti-imperialist. Xi Jinping speaks for the free market. Listen to him. He wants the free market. He wants to go to a situation in which he has a say in how it's done, and we transact. I don't think the left should want that.
Well, okay. So I think I partially also agree with something. I just potentially see that there could be a evolution in a more positive way. But yeah. All right. Thank you very much, Costas. And it was really a pleasure. We're gonna see you again in Pisa this July. All right.
It's been a pleasure talking to you, and my greetings to all friends and comrades, and I look forward to the next discussion.
Thank you. All right.